31 days, yes, you can, and then you would not be subject to needing to register with the department because you're not doing home sharing. Home sharing is defined as 30 days or less at a time. And then the main point to that was also the primary residence. So if you're a primary resident, the ordinance applies to you. 31 days or more does not apply, does obviously not apply to traditional hotels, motels, bed and breakfasts. Those are also exempt.
So if somebody wants a monthly stay and there's 28 days in the month, we have to register. Or if there's only 30 days in the month, we have to register. It has to be 31.
That's correct, 30 days or more, that's right.
Really great.
How to qualify for the home sharing program. So this is the qualifications that ended up being in the ordinance. Number one, a primary residence, as we talked about. There's a small exception to that. This one exception to the primary residence rule is pre-2017 permitted ADUs. Anybody know what an ADU is? Hey, my planning nerds back there. So yeah, accessory dwelling unit it's not just any backyard sort of structure. It's a defined term. It's a second dwelling unit on a lot. It's a full dwelling unit with a kitchen. It's rentable. It's legal. They're basically allowed by state law in 2017 on a much wider scale. And so that's where the decision makers, I think this happened at City Planning Commission, decided to create this line in the sand and saying these older ones can be grandfathered in. However, newer ones are really meant to be part of the housing stock. It's a housing solution to allow a second dwelling unit in single family neighborhoods, which is a really big deal for the state of California. The idea was we're doing this because of the housing crisis, and we're doing this because folks need more affordable places to live in these neighborhoods. So a decision was made that accessory dwelling units should be treated like any other dwelling unit, and therefore you would need to live in that ADU to be able to home share it. But you cannot just live in your main front home and rent out that back dwelling unit. Again, they're really meant for long-term renters. And I'll just mention there's a state bill just passed by Governor Newsom, who signed it last week here in LA, amending state ADU law. And actually one of the provisions is saying statewide, if you build an ADU starting 2020, most ADUs will be banned from doing short-term rentals statewide. I don't know that a lot of people know that. That was in AB 68, Assembly Bill 68, actually made that a state law as well. I know there's questions about ADUs.
So if it's attached to your home, but it has a private entrance.
We have, please, I'm sorry, please. We're gonna get to your questions, I promise. We're gonna get through all of them. Rentals cannot be subject to the RSO. We've talked about that, the rent stabilization ordinance, just to talk a little bit more about that. Again, we're talking about pre-1978 multifamily buildings or properties with 2 or more units on them become subject to the rent control, rent stabilized ordinance. There's a big question about what if I live, I'm the primary resident in an RSO. I own the RSO building, so I am a primary resident. And you may think that you're exempt because the city's housing department issues what's called a temporary exemption for people that live and own and occupy a rent stabilized building. But the housing department has clarified for us that that's only a temporary exemption, year by year. They basically send you out something every year because they say the structure is still subject to the rent control ordinance. It's a temporary exemption process every year to show that you actually live there. So I know that's a big point of contention for owners of rent control buildings. We're going to talk more about it, but this is an issue that actually is live in front of City Council. This is probably the one area that has the most momentum at City Council to make potential changes. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know when it's going to happen. But that idea of owner occupants of maybe smaller rent control buildings, maybe duplexes to fourplexes, if you're an owner-occupied unit, you're owner-occupant, and are in an RSO building, there is active consideration to perhaps allow for that at City Council, but that would have to come from City Council.
When are they gonna know that?
I'm gonna actually show you at the very end how you can follow that and get engaged in that and be notified of all changes as that. In fact, there's some action on it next Tuesday, but I'll talk a little bit more about and give you the tools so you can follow it very closely. Fourth here, so we have another restriction on basically restricted affordable units. These are units that are income restricted, rent restricted, usually because they've got some subsidy or because the city has given them some incentive to include affordable housing. The idea is they're already getting reduced rents. This is an important part of our housing stock. We want to make sure those are protected. Also, Ellis conversion. It's a wonky term. It's a process established by the state that allows landlords to get out of the rental market business. And basically say, I don't want to be a landlord anymore. I want to either demolish my building, I want to remove these units from the rental market. It's a very formalized, regulated process under LA law and state law. It's called an Ellis Act removal. You have to go to the city and say, I want to remove these units from the rental market. So there is a prohibition. We did not want to incentivize that behavior, frankly. We did not want folks to take a rental building and deconvert it to a single family building. And so it's a particular limitation on basically if you Ellis, we call it, to a single family building to get out of the rental market. There's a 5-year ban on that, to not want to incentivize folks to just get out of the rental business, again, with the housing crisis in mind. Landlord approval. So if you're a tenant, you're going to be asked to get approval from your landlord. This was something the landlords pushed very hard for. So we have basically a template, a form. You may have seen it. We have this document called Administrative Guidelines. And if you haven't looked at it, that's the go-to place for all your questions. It's a kind of a 30-page document on our website, home sharing administrative guidelines that not only hopefully explains everything better than I could do in much more detail, but also has these forms available. So we also have these forms available on our website separately, where you can just print that out, bring it to your landlord, and have that signed. And finally, obviously you have to be legally registered as a host to participate. So, talk a little bit more about primary residence. Primary residence is defined as the home where you live for more than 6 months of the year. The general idea is that everyone has one primary residence. You cannot have 2 primary residences. And it's defined as the place where you live for 6 months or more. That is really the whole purpose of having folks register with the city, is to verify that indeed they are the primary residence. So that's why we ask for the documentation. I'll talk a little bit more about that process in a second. But generally, we're also talking about not only the home, but generally we're also, primary residence extends to the property. So it's like if my address is your single family dwelling, perhaps, your whole property is your primary residence. Except when you have multiple units on that property, like an ADU or just a duplex or any other situation. Of course, if there's multiple units, then you can't be the primary residence for those other units. You could only be for one of those units. Okay, we wanted to talk about detached structures that are not ADUs. Okay, this is another area we know there's a lot of questions about. I have this backyard garage thing. I have this converted yoga studio thing. I have this backyard thing that we converted to do home sharing in. We know there's a lot of that in LA. The basic idea was to try to allow for that. As long as it's not a pure dwelling unit, it doesn't have a kitchen, it doesn't have, it's not an ADU again, but it's just a converted structure that's not a dwelling unit, doesn't have a kitchen. The idea is you could use those spaces as an extension of your home. The catch is we need it to be safe and habitable. And so there's basically a restriction that these spaces can be used to the extent that they're approved for residential use. That's basically a fancy way of saying they need to be permitted as safe and habitable and inspected by our Department of Building and Safety. There's basically a building code that applies for garages, and then there's a building code that applies for a place where it's fit for people to stay and live and sleep and not worry about any dangers of unpermitted activity. So some of you may have these spaces, you may have questions. I would encourage talking to Building and Safety. I'll just say we're still in communication with them on this issue. There's some nuance in terms of what zone and your setbacks, and you may have to replace your parking. There's some kind of caveats that are going to be case by case specifics. But I encourage you to go talk to Building and Safety if you have one of these structures, to see if it's, number one, you can check your C of O, your certificate of occupancy on that building, see what it was approved for, if it wasn't approved for residential use at the time. If not, you may have to do a change of use to a new structure that is permitted up to the building code for people to live and sleep in. But that would be the Department of Building and Safety. What is not allowed is structures not approved for residential use, and that generally is, just garages, trailers, recreational vehicles, tents, attics, things that were never meant for people to actually stay in long term. Okay, so once you've become registered and gone through the gauntlet and are now have your registration number, we're going to go through some of those sort of use regulations or sort of requirements in terms of hosting. So first and perhaps most importantly is this cap idea of 120-day cap, and we know this was hugely controversial. This was one of the biggest issues discussed in front of City Council. We did multiple reports on it. The basic idea was that, again, at a certain point it becomes so lucrative to do short-term rental that it becomes a financial real inducement incentive to do whatever you can to get out of the long-term rental market and become a short-term rental market, and trying to keep those incentives leaning towards the long-term renters, again, given the housing crisis. However, through the discussion, City Council was lobbied and we were asked to create a way to go beyond this cap. And so that's the process called extended home sharing, where you can actually go through a separate process, a little more rigorous. And I'll go through that in a second. Basically, for if you'd like the opportunity to go year round. We'll just take a little closer look at those, and I'll talk more about the extended home sharing. But everyone, if you don't have extended home sharing registration, the 120-day cap works. Let me just explain quickly. The way that works is it's 120 days per calendar year. Okay, so
that's all 2019.
Right. So if you've registered this year, whenever from the day you started registering, say you were great and you registered on July 1st, your 120-day count starts on July 1st when you registered and got your registration number, and that would be valid till the end of the year. And then come January, you get a new 120 days in your bank account, so to speak, to use that year. And you'll have that 120 days for that next year as long as you stay registered, which means basically you will want to renew upon your annual. So there's two separate kind of confusing time frames to think about. One is when did you register? That becomes your registration date that you would have to renew a year from that registration date. So July, you renew next July. And we're going to try to help you out, remind you, send you an email when you get close to that so you'll remember to renew. But then this 120 days on a separate clock. The 120 days is on the calendar year clock. So a little confusing.
Is that consecutive days or nights of stay?
Okay, thanks. So 120 days of short-term rental use. So it's not consecutive. It's because we're always talking about less than 30-day stays. But you add all those stays of less than 30 days, you add all those up, and the 120-day cap applies to that. Stays of more than 30 days, say you've got somebody staying for 2 months in the middle of your home sharing, that does not count against your number. Okay, so we're just counting how many days are short-term rental in that cap. Okay, and then we've got some additional rules here. One on occupancy limits, just kind of a general safety guideline. And habitability is a maximum of 2 adults per room. It's called habitable room. We've defined habitable room again in our administrative guidelines of what exactly is a habitable room if you're not sure. But it's most rooms in your house, including kitchens, living room, dining room, bedrooms, not your bathrooms, not your utility rooms, but generally places where it's, again, kind of safe for people to sleep if they had to. But living room, dining room, all those things are basically counting as habitable rooms. We ask you when you register, tell us how many habitable rooms you have, and that essentially becomes an occupancy limit on adults. Children are not included in this. It's a limitation on adults, and I think we're actually going to put that on. We're going to give you a certificate. When you finally, many of you probably are wondering, I registered a month or two ago, but I haven't got my final registration yet. I was given a pending by the city. And I'll tell you, we finally started issuing the finals just a few days ago. And I'll tell you, we're starting from the beginning. So those of you who did register first will be the first to get your final, and you'll get this little certificate from the city that'll have your sort of occupancy limit and other information on it. Again, it'll come in your email. So that's another, thank you. Some people have told me I've never heard from the city. I submitted my registration. I didn't hear back. It should have been instantly emailed to the email address that you provided us. Sometimes it may go in your spam box, so check that if you haven't got it. But yes, we would get the final at the same email that you get this. And all communications will go through that email essentially.
What's the link?
Sorry?
Yeah.
So we're just starting it. We've got 2,000 to go through right now. It's taking us about 5 minutes each to go through all of them. do the math. It's gonna take some time to get through them all. So it depends again where you were in the queue. I can't give you an exact date, but just to be clear, pending gives you the same status as a regular. It's the same number. We're not going to change the number on you. It just switches status, and it doesn't really give you any more or less rights. Pending gives you the same ability to do home sharing legally as final. I know having that final is important as well, and we'll be trying to get those out to you as soon as possible.
So you keep posting while you're in pending status?
Sorry, I'm gonna just keep moving. Make sure you write it down. Does everyone have the opportunity to write them down? I don't know if we need to go through the audience again with questions right now, but one set of guests at a time. Okay, I know this is another thing that's caused some concern. The idea is you could have multiple listings. You could have your whole house listing, your one bedroom listing, maintain separate listings. But the idea is that you shouldn't have multiple bedrooms being rented to different parties at the same time. And I know some people have said, what's the problem with that? Sometimes it's not a problem. I think the concern we heard from other cities, from neighbors, is those situations had a tendency to get a little more intense on the neighborhood, more coming and going. Sometimes people didn't know what they were getting into. A little more like a boarding house situation, a bed and breakfast situation. This was trying to be just more of a lower scale home sharing, I would say. All these things could be looked at. I'll just note, like Santa Monica did not have this limit, and they had big problems. They just went 2 weeks ago to put some limits on the amount of guests that were able to rent at the same time because it was some egregious situations. Of course, it's not always bad, but the idea is that it could allow for a little more intense and nuisance activity to take place.
But that contradicts
No.
bed and breakfast.
Bed and breakfast is a separate use that does allow for that, and you go through a whole process to vet that. But so this is not meant to be the same as a bed and breakfast. This is a little less
Saying, like,
intense
if
as a
you
bed
have
and breakfast.
You have 2 rooms in a house, you can only rent out one.
One at a time. You could do your one bedroom listing one night and your whole house the next night or
Or
something.
You
But
could rent out 2, but to one family, let's say.
it's
Yes.
one booking, one party. They could you could do your 3 bedrooms all to one party, but not one bedroom to one party, one bedroom to another party, one bedroom to another party. No commercial uses, so these again is about home sharing for out-of-town guests or whoever else, but not for sort of commercial activities, selling products, things like that. There's some limitation on outdoor sound amplification equipment at night, and there's also some limitations on outdoor congregations, 8 p.m. more than 8 people. This is the type of thing that if your neighbors are really upset because there's a party going on and there's some really loud music, they would probably maybe complain, and then somebody may come out and look at this. Are you violating these regulations? But keep on good terms with your neighbors and don't cause too many problems at night. You'll probably be fine. Just some additional responsibilities. So we mentioned you get your registration number from the city, put it on all your listings.